All right, welcome to another installment. We're going to be beginning the book of Obadiah in this particular session. Obadiah is a very short book of the Bible. It's only one chapter long. You can easily flip past it. It's in that bulk of 12 shorter books at the end of the Old Testament. Obadiah is a prophet of God. So Obadiah is a man that has been chosen by Yahweh God to put his words in his mouth. So when Obadiah writes this, when he speaks this prophecy, he's speaking the very words of God himself. And Obadiah is a prophecy against the nation of Edom. And we will talk about Edom in a moment here. When I first started studying the Bible, it took me a long time to get used to all the names and nations. I had to look at a lot of maps, and even to this day, I do confuse some of them. But we'll talk about Edom in a moment. But the general gist of the book of Obadiah is that God has a beef with Edom primarily because of the way Edom treats the nation of Israel. And the overall message of Obadiah is if you mess with God's people, you're going to get it. But that's not the only thing that Yahweh has a problem with Edom. He has other issues with Edom, and we're going to look at one of them today. I titled this teaching, Arrogance Leads to Self-Deception. Arrogance leads to self-deception. We're going to see that in verse 3. But before we get there, why don't we look at verse 1, and we'll get our bearings here. Verse 1 says, "The revelation of Obadiah. So the Lord Yahweh has said to Edom, we have listened to a report from Yahweh, and an ambassador has been sent out among the nations. Arise, and let us arise over it for war." So in the first sentence, the revelation of Obadiah, that's telling us that the prophet Obadiah had a revelation, and here's what it is. So the Lord Yahweh God is speaking through Obadiah to the nation of Edom. Now, let's identify Edom here. I'm going to give you some background, some history. This goes back to the book of Genesis. Very often, nations they're the descendants of a single man. One man will have children who will have children who will have children who will have children. And once you get enough of them, they begin to be identified as a country or nation or people group. So if you take the man named Israel and you look at all his descendants, you would call them the Israelites. Sometimes you would just call the whole nation by the man's name, Israel, as it is to this day. Edom, they are the descendants of a man named Esau. And I'm going to show you that in Genesis 25. And Esau is a twin brother with Israel. So let's read in Genesis 25, beginning in verse 24. I probably should have included the verses right before this, because right before these verses, God prophesies that these two children will become two nations. And he also says in so many words that they're going to be fighting each other. Genesis 25, beginning in verse 24. And when Rebekah's days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. So here's the man named Esau, and all of his descendants one day will be called the nation of Edom. Verse 26, and after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. Now the man Jacob will be renamed Israel later in the book of Genesis. So the Esauites is Edom, and the Jacobites are Israel. Now, let me fast forward in the book of Genesis all the way to chapter 36 and verse 1. In chapter 36, we get more details of what becomes of Esau and his descendants. This is where we're going to get more details about the nation of Edom. Genesis 36:1. Now, these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom. So right here in this verse, it's identifying Edom as Esau. So they are one and the same. Now we're going to fast forward just a few verses. Genesis 36, verses 6 to 8. And Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all the persons of his house and his cattle and all his beasts and all his substance which he had got in the land of Canaan, and went into the country from the face of his brother Jacob. So this is where we see Esau and Jacob part ways. You would think that these two family members would share the same land and have the same descendants, and they would be one nation, but that is not what happens. Esau relocates, and he separates himself from Jacob's family, and this is where you begin to see the division between the nation of Edom and the nation of Israel. Let's keep reading in verse 7. For their riches were more than they might dwell together, and the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle. Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. So once again, we get the identification that Edom and Esau are the same person or nation. And here we get their location. Esau dwelt in Mount Seir. So if you can visualize the Middle East, the nation of Edom, the descendants of Esau, are south of Israel. Genesis 36, further in the chapter, verse 31. And these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. This verse is very curious to me because I believe Genesis was written by Moses before kings reigned in Israel. So I have wondered if this is prophetic. Some have argued that it's a sentence that's written later on in time. I haven't quite decided how to take that yet. But what we learn in this verse is that the nation of Edom is, they're maybe I'll use the word established before the Israelites are. If you remember, the Israelites, they have a side journey before they settle in their land. They go down to Egypt for many, many years. Then, once they come out of Egypt, they have some years of wandering in the wilderness, and then they enter into the land, and even that is somewhat of a process. So the Edomites, the people of Esau, they settle in their land before the Israelites do, even though they are twins. They were started at the same time. And there's even a moment in the book of Numbers when the Israelites ask for passage through the land of Edom to get to the promised land, and Edom rejects that, much to the displeasure of God. The other thing you need to understand about Edom is that they are not the people of God. There are certainly saved Edomites, but in the Old Testament, when God makes a covenant with the nation of Israel, it is to that brother and that family and those descendants. Edom is settled in their land at the time when God appears at Mount Sinai to Israel. Edom, they have their own idols. They are idolaters. So even though they are twin brothers, they're very much at odds with one another. Although there is an interesting verse, I don't have it displayed, but there is an interesting verse where God forbids the Israelites from harming the Edomites because of their relation. Now let's go back to Obadiah 1. So the Lord Yahweh has said to Edom, and this is a negative thing, he's speaking against Edom, and here's where it begins. We have listened to a report from Yahweh, and an ambassador has been sent out among the nations. Arise, and let us arise over it for war. The pronouns here are interesting, and I'm curious as to how others might interpret this. But the way I'm taking this is God is speaking, but he's pretending to be the nations. There was a report sent out from God. There was this ambassador who had a message from God, and this ambassador went to all of the nations, and they said, hey, go fight Edom. The idea here is God is declaring his judgment against Edom, and it comes in the form of foreign nations going to war with Edom. This is a very strong reminder of the sovereignty of God in controlling nations and countries. The borders of nations wax and wane. People groups are conquered, they're slaughtered or enslaved. Groups are entirely relocated. There's mass immigration due to warfare. And these things are all in the hands of God. God is the one who has the ability to make leaders of nations do things or forbid them from doing things. Those leaders certainly do not know, they're not conscious of obeying God in those moments, but they are well in the control of God. All the nations of the world are chess pieces before God, and he moves them however he pleases. And in this case, he's saying, I'm going to move all the chess pieces against Edom. So God is causing the neighboring countries to war against Edom. Oh, and another thing to note about that, it's important to see the divine hand in such things, because one could make the mistake of saying that humans are fighting one another. You know, we're losing favor with the world's nations because of X, Y, and Z, or that nation has it out against us, when really the fundamental issue is that you have displeased God, and God is bringing his judgment on you. Certainly through intermediaries, certainly through a means, but it is ultimately God's hand behind it. So we must see through the tool that is being used and see the one wielding it. It is Yahweh. Now let's look at verse 2 of Obadiah. Verse 2 says, Behold, I am giving you as small among the nations. You are being very disesteemed. Edom was a smaller nation. Certainly, even today, when you look at geopolitics and the world and all the nations and how they ally themselves with one another and how they talk on the world stage and at the United Nations and things like that, you can certainly see that some nations are more powerful than others, some are more obscure than others. Edom was a smaller country, and God is saying, I am going to give you up to war, and I'm going to make it so all the nations see, they realize, they register you're a small, puny country. And it also says in verse 2, you are being very disesteemed. God is essentially, he's lowering their reputation. He's ruining their reputation in the sight of other nations so as to instigate this war. Verse 3. This is the last verse we're going to look at in this session, and this is where I get the title of this teaching. In verse 3, the insolence of your heart has beguiled you. The one lying in the crevices of a crag, the heights of his dwelling, saying in his heart, who will bring me down to the earth? Now, as I said earlier, the main beef that God has with the nation of Edom is the way that they have treated Israel. We'll see that later in the book. But one of the other beefs that God has with Edom is this right here. He does not like how arrogant and insolent they are. We see this feeling, this thought that God has very often in the scripture. He very often hates it when people are proud, arrogant, etc. Now, here in verse 3, it says, the insolence or the arrogance of your heart has beguiled you. Beguiled means to trick or deceive. And that's where I'm drawing the title of this teaching from. Arrogance leads to self-deception. And we even get to see some of the internal thoughts that Edom is having. The one saying in his heart, who will bring me down to the earth? Now, Edom, I'm not terribly familiar with the geography of Edom, but this verse indicates that the Edomites, although they were a smaller nation, they were very strategically placed. They were in the heights, they were above rocks, they had the high ground, so to speak. They were a nation that was, humanly speaking, safe. They had a good military location. It was hard to penetrate into the Edomites. And that gave them a sense of arrogance and pride. So much so that they thought themselves invincible. Who is going to bring me down from here? The idea is no one's going to touch me. But here's the interesting thing about this particular deception. As I said in the title, arrogance leads to self-deception. Deception can come from many sources. A demon can deceive you. A demon can cook up a lie in his head and then try to communicate it to you. A fellow human can deceive you. A false teacher can craft a lie, a very cunning lie, and then try to convince you of it. But here's the tragic irony of the arrogant. The arrogant, they are not deceived by others. They are, in fact, deceived by themselves. They are the originator and victim of their own deception. They are the ones who very strategically craft lies, and then they feed the lie back to themselves. So they are literally tricking themselves, and they do so to their own detriment. In this particular context, The particular self-deception that these Edomites are suffering from is they have a false sense of security. They do not believe they will be judged or suffer at the hands of God. They believe they cannot be militarily conquered. But that is a false security. They have lied to themselves. They trick themselves. And the question is, why would humans do such a thing, and how can such a thing happen? Why would a human lie to themselves to their own hurt? And the answer is, that is the nature of arrogance. That is the nature of insolence. Okay, now let me show you some verses where we see this attitude, this mindset described. Proverbs 21:24. Proud and haughty scorner is his name, who dealeth in proud wrath. So proud and haughty, this is the same concept that we're seeing in Obadiah, the insolent, the arrogant. These are individuals who feel that they have a right to pour out wrath on others. They feel pleasure in it. They deem themselves better than others, and they scorn. They speak wrath. These are people who are highly critical, very unreasonable, and they immerse themselves in that. Psalm chapter 10 and verse 4. The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. So here we see one of the other fruits of pride. People who are proud or arrogant, they have an overestimation of themselves. They believe themselves smarter than they actually are. They believe themselves more capable and emotionally stronger than they actually are. They consider themselves more righteous than they actually are. They look at themselves and think that they're a 10 out of 10, when really they're nowhere near that. And consequently, because of that, they will not seek after God. You do not need God if you genuinely believe that you have no need of him. If you believe you are capable of being righteous enough or wise enough or strong enough, then you will not perceive your desperate condition wherein you desperately need God. But the wicked, in his pride, will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. This man will not go to God in prayer. This man will not go to God for forgiveness because he believes he has nothing that needs forgiven. He will not go to God for strength because he believes himself strong enough. That's the type of thing we're seeing in Obadiah. The insolence of their heart makes them believe, they have an overestimation of themselves. They believe that they are safe, that they are okay. And it's this very thing that leads them to lie to themselves. I am strong enough. I have a good location here. But of course, that is only going to lead to death, to corruption, to destruction. As we read in Proverbs 16, verses 18 to 19, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Very famous words. We hear this all the time. Even among unbelievers, we hear them say this. Pride goes before a fall. In verse 19, better it is to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. So arrogance and pride, they lead to an unhealthy self-reliance, and it leads to a very hateful spirit, one that speaks wrath to his fellow man. And there are other verses that say God hates pride. And ultimately, it will lead to destruction or a fall. All right, that's all we're going to be looking at in this session, but we will continue through the book of Obadiah moving forward. Until then, grace and peace to you.